Hello and welcome, everybody. I am joined today by Robert Schneiker. He is a geologist who has a strong interest in archaeology, and he spent a lot of time studying Gobekli Tepe and the Sphinx. So, welcome, Bob, and thank you for joining me here today. And I'd like you to
Thanks
begin.
for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're here. And I was wondering if we could just start off with something basic, just sort of your academic background, and then how you transitioned from being interested in primarily, I guess, geological scientific topics to being interested in some of the debates surrounding these archaeological sites.
That's a really good question, and it's not a straight line. My background is as a geologist, a geophysicist. I have a master's degree in geophysics. And on top of that, I've always been interested in computers. And so 30 some years ago now, I can't believe that, I ended up doing modeling for the state of Wisconsin that was used to develop soil cleanup standards protective of groundwater quality. And I had no idea what I was doing. I was just running the models. And then I realized in the way that those regs are written, and other states have followed suit, that there was a need for people to do site-specific modeling. So I developed a software package that simulates the migration of contaminants in soil and groundwater. I didn't write the models. I just put a front end and a back end and added databases and such. And as a part of that, I do training for regulatory agencies and also consultants. And as part of the training, I describe the processes that control where the contamination is going. So you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with anything that this podcast is supposedly about? Well, it does, because I was watching Nova about um, 11 years ago now, and Mark Lehner was in the Sphinx enclosure, and he was explaining how shallow groundwater is wicking up and evaporating at the surface. And as it evaporates, salt is being deposited, and the salt crystals fill the pore spaces, and then they warm up in the daytime, and eventually it causes the rock to exfoliate because of all the salt that's now formed as a crust just below the surface. And the same thing can happen with contaminants. They can wick up off the water table and then either concentrate at the surface like a salt, or if they're volatile, they might volatilize to the atmosphere. So I was going to use the Sphinx as an example in my training of how contamination can wick upward. And it's a very difficult process because everyone thinks of rain falling on the ground and, like a coffee percolator, picking up some contamination and carrying it to the water table. It's difficult to conceive of the water wicking up and maybe even picking up contaminant in the soil and carrying it to the surface. But it does happen, especially in a dry desert environment if there's water below. So
Ah,
that was the whole point. And that led to me presenting. Well, then I found that Robert Schoch was saying that the Sphinx was older, and I thought, oh my goodness, I mean, he's so misunderstood the wicking groundwater that he's created a lost civilization. So I did some modeling with my software, and I realized very quickly that no, the groundwater, that is actually occurring. There's no question that that's occurring on the Sphinx, and there's no question that it's eroding the Sphinx and the sidewall. But it cannot possibly account for the degree of erosion on the Sphinx. So now I'm hooked. I'm going to figure out what that is. And so that's my introduction to this.
I guess that's an interesting way to go about it because I know most of the people who end up studying these kind of things don't come from a scientific background normally. And usually then they are just kind of struggling to explain basic science, and it comes across as very awkward many times.
Yeah, I mean, and also for me, um, the way that I got into it, it suddenly became this thing like, okay, if nobody, this is now a mystery, and I'm going to figure it out. There's a part of me that said, okay, now I'm hooked. I have to figure this out. So I backed up all the way. Well, first, I started looking at just what's happened over the last 4,500 years. And I realized that there's no way that there's anything that's happened over the last 4,500 years that could make the Sphinx look as eroded as it does. And I was puzzled by that. So I started kind of out of frustration. I went back to the very beginning and started looking at the deposition of the limestone of that the Sphinx was carved from, and carried that through till today. I don't know if you saw, I've done videos on that, the Great Sphinx from the Eocene to the Anthropocene.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to watch the video, but I did see the thumbnail for that one.
So, and what I found was perhaps one of the most amazing geologic stories that you could imagine. I honestly, I thought, because I didn't know this, I thought, well, okay, so the rock was deposited 40 million years ago during what's called the Eocene. And that stands for the dawn of the new. And it starts 9 million years after the dinosaurs were wiped out by the asteroid. And the previous period was not, that 9 million year long period was called the Paleocene. And so I started looking at it, and then I said, I don't know if you've ever looked, there's temperature plots that go way back. And the difference between the Paleocene and the Eocene, there's a huge spike in global temperatures. And that's from an event called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And as crazy as it sounds, that was a release of greenhouse gases to Earth's atmosphere. And the scale of the release is mind-boggling. Some of the estimates I've seen are saying it's as much as the known fossil fuel reserves on Earth, and others are saying perhaps 3 times the known fossil fuel reserves on Earth.
So we're talking about putting the level of greenhouse gases to something like it was during the dinosaur period.
Yeah, well, it wasn't actually that high during the dinosaur period, but it was definitely, at least towards the end, I don't know all the way through, it was comparable to that. So carbon dioxide levels went over 1,000 parts per million. I've seen some estimates with 3,000. I don't remember those off the top of my head, but somewhere in that range.
Wow. Okay.
And then the Earth recovered, and so I read everything. Being an inquisitive person, I read everything that I could on the PETM, as it's called. And then I'm like, well, wait, I'm not wasting my time on the PETM. I'm wasting my time trying to figure out what's going on the Sphinx. So I went back and I looked at the Sphinx, and I pulled up an old photo, and I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, I think, because there's a hyperthermal, that's what the PETM is. I'm like, I think there's a hyperthermal in the Sphinx. And now I'm like, okay, now some people are seeing lost civilizations and ancient aliens and Atlantis, and I'm seeing hyperthermals. The odds of a hyperthermal being exposed in the Sphinx would be almost like finding the layer, the iridium layer that killed off the dinosaurs, exposed in the Sphinx. It's a worldwide global warming event.
Right. So can you elaborate on what a hyperthermal is?
Sure, a hyperthermal, there's a series of them, mostly during the Eocene, and they were produced by a huge amount of carbon dioxide released to Earth's atmosphere. And the source of the carbon is an organic source. So it isn't coming from volcanoes or something. So when plants do photosynthesis, they tend to concentrate stable isotope carbon-12 in their organic material. And if you were to then burn the plant, then it would release the carbon-12 that it has in it, and then you'd get a higher carbon-12 measurement in the past in the rocks that are deposited at that time. And so that's one of the ways in which we know that these hyperthermals occurred in Earth's past. It's due to the release of a huge amount of organic carbon to Earth's atmosphere. And what caused it? I mean, there's various sources. Like the PETM, there's some thought that there was a lot of organic material, basically like coal, at the northern regions of what is now the Atlantic. And as the Atlantic Ridge was opening up, the lava burned all of that coal and released it to the atmosphere. There's various other thoughts on it.
Wow.
So, looking at it and thinking that there's a Miko. So I actually met with Mark Lehner, and I mentioned that to him. This is like 10 years ago now, 8 years ago. I traveled to Boston, and I mentioned that, and he was intrigued by that. So he said, who else would know more? And I said, well, there's a particular person, Scott Wing, at the Smithsonian. And so I wrote to him and I said, I think that the Miko, the Middle Eocene climatic optimum, is exposed in the Sphinx. And he wrote back saying that the Sphinx, that the Miko is in SBZ 17. I had no idea what SBZ 17 was, but it's very fine divisions in time. And it turns out that there's a particular, there are fossils that are called index fossils. And so if you find that fossil, and there's people who can identify fossils like people identify cars. They can just look at it and say, oh, by the shape of the taillight or the color of the car or some aspect about it, they'll know the year. Well, there's people who can do that with fossils.
Right.
And those are called index fossils. And one of the index fossils is Nummulites gizihensis. So guess what? It's at Giza. And it also turns out that when that particular species of Nummulites, it's a single cell organism. When it goes extinct, that starts SBZ 17. So it looks like I'm right.
Wow.
That there is an exposure of the Miko at the neck, and that explains why the limestone just beneath the neck is so soft. Probably the softest section on the Sphinx, because what was happening there is that limestone gets deposited as kind of an ooze with all these fossils at the bottom of the ocean. And eventually more and more of it gets layered on top and the water gets squeezed out. But during a hyperthermal, the oceans become so acidic that they start weathering that ooze. And in fact, the concentrations in the ocean, they can become so acidic that instead of depositing limestone, they'll actually erode the limestone. And that creates an unconformity, a break in the depositional record. And then the head of the Sphinx, turns out that as the ocean acidification gradually receded, it took about 500,000 years, maybe less, but somewhere around there. As the ocean acidification declined, then limestone deposition started again, this time with no fossils and with a higher clay content. And that's why the layer of the Sphinx head is so much more resistant to weathering and erosion.
Huh.
I know, that's crazy.
Yeah. So basically, when the Egyptians carved this thing out, they weren't aware that the layers that they were working with had different geological histories.
Well, they had no idea on that, but so what they did is the rock then that became the Sphinx was deeply buried, and then eventually, I'm not going to get into the details right now, but eventually it was eroded and brought to the surface, and the layer that was deposited during the Miko was more resistant to weathering and erosion, and it formed a capstone. So it formed the Giza, and it's not a plateau; it's an anticline, or you could call it a cuesta. So it slopes. So a plateau differs from an anticline in that a plateau has cliffs on all the sides. So if you've ever been to Utah and you've seen, plateaus out there, it's flat lying rock, and on the very top, it's flat. But at Giza, it slopes down. So it actually slopes from the pyramids down towards the Sphinx. So it slopes down towards the southeast from the pyramids. And there's actually a harbor right where the Sphinx is, because it's actually in the Nile floodplain. So to call, the Sphinx being on a plateau and it's technically in the Nile floodplain. That's a reach for me.
No, and I see
And it
that in
also,
the one of the images you provided. You can definitely tell that there's a little ridge line behind the Sphinx with the pyramids in the background.
so which,
I was looking at the after construction photo you have on the model scenario slide.
yeah, let me see. Let me pull that up at my end. Yeah, so it basically slopes down. So originally, as I see it, the entire Giza anticline was covered with limestone to the top of the Sphinx head, roughly.
I
And
can
it
see
didn't
that.
just
That makes
and it
sense.
didn't just cover a portion of the. So what slide are you on?
I'm on the model scenarios, which is slide 7.
Oh, okay. So that I made that a long time ago. The first one I don't really like, but that's kind of a different topic. Let me finish this. So the so originally, and George Reisner said this back in 1942. He was an Egyptian archaeologist, and he indicated that he thought that the top of the Sphinx head roughly marked the top of Giza at the time. The surface that you see there is flat. That is not a natural surface. There's nothing at Giza, anywhere at Giza, that is a natural exposed surface that was there thousands of years ago. So if, as Schock and others are saying that the Sphinx was carved at some point prior to the pyramids, well, then the entire Sphinx, including the head, would have been below grade because that limestone, that weather resistant limestone, was there capping it. And you can tell that there's a softer layer above that because there's what some people call a wadi just to the south of the Sphinx. So it's extremely not probably as soft as the member 2 of the Sphinx, but pretty soft. So the Sphinx is divided into 3 different members from the bottom up, and the bottom layer is what they carved the paws out of, and they did carve the paws right out of the in situ limestone. It wasn't covered with blocks, and you can see claw marks. You can see where they carved claws and such in that. Today, that member 1 section is covered with modern repair, or I'm not sure how new, but with repair blocks. The second member is the surface that shows the undulating pattern that others have identified as erosion. And then basically the other member is basically the Sphinx head, and that's a higher quality limestone.
So basically the limestone around what they used to make the head had probably mostly eroded away by the time they decided to carve the head.
No,
Or no,
no,
or is
the limestone that from which the head was carved didn't erode away. It was quarried to construct the pyramids. So it was an on-site source. They're
ah
not dumb. When they chose that location, they're like, how are we going to build a pyramid? Well, we need limestone. Hey, we
right
got some decent limestone right here. So that's where a lot of it came from. Definitely some came from elsewhere.
ah
But most of the limestone, or a good section of it, and I figured it out roughly, it's roughly the volume of the first pyramid is the amount of material that was carved. And it's a pretty decent quality limestone.
yeah. I mean, it's held up for a long time now. So
Excuse me?
that's held up for a long time now. So it must be pretty good.
Yeah. So the Sphinx head, so that limestone after it got deposited 40 million years ago and was buried. I don't know exactly how deep, but it was buried pretty deep. And it compressed the sediment and formed a rock. Africa is actually moving slowly, not very quickly, but slowly up towards Europe. And as it did, it buckled the rock, and that's what created the anticline that rises uphill from the Sphinx to the pyramids. And as it did that, it fractured the limestone. And if you could see it from the air, if you could see the fractures, it looks pretty much like broken safety glass.
Hmm.
And it was one of those pieces of glass that was fractured, that was not fractured, but it had fractures all around it, from which the Sphinx head was carved. So that fracture-free block of this member 3 limestone is what set the scale of the Sphinx. And I suspect it's the reason that the face, the profile, isn't totally vertical. Because if you look at pictures, I don't know where it is here. I'm sure I'm going through the slides. It's that old picture where it says the Miko, actually, right up at the top. If you look at that, it's an old black and white photo.
Here, I see it. Yeah.
So, yeah, if you look at that, you can see that there's a fracture just behind the neck that goes through the Sphinx body.
Yeah.
And if you look closely, there's another one, a smaller one, and then there's a much larger one. And you can see that they're somewhat evenly spaced.
Right.
Not exactly. So if you were to take that rough distance and go towards the east, going towards the west, if you go to the east, well, one would fall roughly and at the plane of the face. And so that you can see the block right there. You can see that the west end is that big crevice right behind the head in the body, and that would have continued through the harder limestone above. And the next one is not there. We can't see it, but I think that's what the face is. And they definitely built the Sphinx around the limestone. So if you were to look at the face of the Sphinx, you'll see that the eyebrows and the nose and the lips fall on natural bedding planes. So they adjusted the proportions of the pharaoh's face to accommodate the bedding planes that were naturally there in the rock. So that's one of the reasons why it doesn't look exactly like the pharaoh, and one of the reasons why they're saying it's older. At the same time, they're saying it's recarved, so that sounds like a shell game. Right. Thinking about it being recarved, if you're, I don't know, did I put it in here? There's a depiction, and I use that same, it's got to be in here. I use that same basic thing where Shock has the lion head. Put this together some time ago. Let me see if it's in here. Yeah, if you go where it says Shock's lion head, I don't know if I can come up with a number.
Yeah.
So that's Shock's depiction, and he uses it. He likes to dismiss things. Well, that was on that TV show. I didn't have control on it. Well, he actually uses this in his presentations. That sketch of a lion-headed Sphinx, and on it I superimpose that to scale the old photograph. And so now we've got a couple of issues here, or I have. First, the top of the head marked the top of the harder limestone, so you couldn't make the lion head taller, and if you did, it'd be carved out of really soft rock, and so that you can't make the lion's head larger. That's just impossible. There's not enough high quality limestone to have ever done that.
Right.
And then if you look,
it'd also have to weather away in a way that would still make a coherent image.
Yeah, well, it's talking about the erosion. Now if you look at the back of the neck of Shock's depiction, and that notch that's eroded at the back of the Sphinx neck, that's 14 meters of erosion.
Right.
And that could not have been caused by precipitation. I mean, first, supposedly, let's go with this hypothetical thing here, that it had a larger head and there's some high quality limestone. Well, that would have been protected beneath, even as it is today. At the time that old photo was taken, the head would have protected the neck beneath from erosion. The problem also is, so you got 14 meters of erosion at the back of the neck, yet there's absolutely, positively not a hint of erosion on the floor of the Sphinx enclosure. How is that possible? How can you erode something that's actually protected by harder limestone above and not erode even in the least the limestone floor of the Sphinx enclosure? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, because I assume the lion's mane would have had to have been made of the hard limestone like the head, right? If this was how it actually looked originally.
Well, you would think. I mean, so what is that exactly? All I can tell you is that geologically, from what I see of that, because of that wadi to the south, whatever, and I know what the formation is, but I don't know exactly how hard it is, and especially how hard it is right there. But because of that valley to the south, and because the limestone, like Reisner said, was the top, because it's this erosion resistant limestone, then it's impossible to have made that bigger head. And you got Robert Temple with his Anubis. Well, that's even more
Yeah,
ridiculous.
I see the image of that. But another point about the lion, though, um, I'm pretty sure the earliest evidence we have of lions being really symbolically important as symbols of kingship and power is with the Sumerians, maybe about 3,500 or so BCE. So there would really not be a compelling reason to think that some Ice Age civilization would carve a big lion. I also don't think
Well,
lions
they're
were all
not
that
an ice
prominent.
age. Well, it's certainly not the ice age because this is 4,500 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, but if you assume that it's older, yeah, why would they do it? But there is a tie-in to the lion, which everyone they always talk, Hancock and Carlson and Schock, and others they talk about. We can include Rogan in because he's so into this now.
Yeah.
They include it was a lion looking at its, at the sunrise 12,000 years ago and seeing its own image. Well, first off, at the sunrise, you wouldn't see Leo, you'd see the sun. So that's not the case. But there's also a tie-in with Leo, the lion, and the Nile, because it is in August when the Nile starts flooding every year. And there are depictions, ancient depictions, and there's even some still today. There's fountains around the planet, especially in Europe, that are lions dispensing water from their mouths. So there's your Leo connection. And
Right.
again, I'm a geologist. This is more your area as an archaeologist. I'm just like, I can see this. What do you think of it?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that lions as images are, would have to be from the historical period almost, because that's really when lion imagery becomes super popular, and it spreads from Mesopotamia to Egypt, and then from there, I mean, obviously you find lions in Greece, India, Britain, I mean, you name it. Lions represent royal power, and even in the New World, rather than using lions because they didn't have lions around, started using jaguars. So there's just something about big cats, I guess, that give people a sense of kingship and power and maybe entitlement.
So what is the tie-in with lion? I mean, I think it's the Nile with the Nile floods, but why did others? It's am I reading too much into this? I
Um,
wonder.
no, it's just one of those. It's basically the first meme. It just was something that really caught on, and every ruler in the world who either saw the Sumerians or then the Egyptians adopt lion imagery, they also wanted to be the lion. So they
Yeah, but
just
with water. So
right.
why water?
Well,
Why do they have lion fountains?
I imagine it's because of the link between the king's power and then the importance of irrigation. Would be my guess, because unless you have functioning irrigation, not only we have a lot of disputes over water, but you also won't have reliable harvest. So I mean, there's
Well,
also
you bring up something really interesting, and for me, when I went to Egypt, it was one of the things I most wanted to see. And that was the Nilometer. Are you familiar with that?
not exactly no.
So what it is somebody back thousands of years ago, they realized that if you measure the Nile water level every day and do that year after year after year, and then compare your measurements on any particular year to the previous years, you can fairly accurately predict how high the Nile is going to rise that particular year.
Hmm.
And so this gave the pharaoh power because if the Nile wasn't going to rise high enough, I would imagine, and again, I'm just imagining this. I could see him going, "You haven't been good this year, so I'm going to punish you."
Yeah.
And and the Nile wouldn't flood. And I'm sure the average person would be like, how in the world he must be a god if he can control the Nile?
Well, the interesting thing about the the Nile in general as compared with the Tigris Euphrates is that it is so reliable and placid. Basically does the same thing every year, and that's why something like that would work. But the problem is, once in a while, if you have a tiny bit of climate change and the flow of the Nile gets interrupted, so you don't have enough rain in Ethiopia, and then you have famine. At that point, because you rely
Oh,
upon the pharaoh to fix things, and then he can't, then he starts having a legitimacy crisis, and that's pretty much what
they had a
caused. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say they had a pretty good idea when that was going to happen,
Yeah,
because if they saw it wasn't rising enough, but of course there's no guarantee here because suddenly things could change, and I know, so it wasn't a perfect
right.
means of predicting the Nile, but it was fairly accurate.
Yeah, I mean it worked most years, and the problem though is that when it doesn't, when you have a little bit of a fluctuation, and then so harvests go down, that actually corresponds with the end of the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and probably New Kingdom as well. Every time the unity of the country was broken up when the pharaoh could no longer guarantee harvest, and they also made the decision, kind of like what China did with the Mandate of Heaven, to link in the performance, agricultural performance, with the pharaoh's job performance and the favorability of the gods to the pharaoh.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
anytime you rely upon the weather to prove your virtue, there are going to be a few times when people are suspecting that there's some foul play in the palace.
Yeah. For me, it was really fascinating to see it because, as far as I know, that would be the first scientific instrument ever that
Do you,
humans used.
do you know about when it would have been used or developed?
Excuse me?
Do you know about when the Nilometer would have been developed?
Oh, it was, I don't, it's on the Palermo stone. So I don't know. It's at least 4,500 years. It may go back 5,000 years, somewhere in that range.
Okay,
I don't know
because
exactly.
I don't know what would be the first scientific measurement thing, but I guess too, it depends on how you would define that, and
True.
also trying to figure out exactly what some of these monuments are trying to highlight, which I guess has been another area of discussion recently. What exactly in the sky are some of these monuments trying to observe or highlight?
I mean, it's just fascinating to see that people are realizing that nature's predictable, I guess, is that it's knowable as opposed to just something that was, you just had to put up with.
Right, exactly. And it's the beginning of people trying to master their environment, because I guess we're really only a few thousand years into the agricultural period where people figured out that you can make plants grow on purpose.
So that's a good tie into your questions that you said you wanted to discuss, which were two things. One was the Gobekli Tepe, the T pillars, and then the Green Sahara. So
Yeah,
since we're in Egypt, let's stick to the Green Sahara for a moment.
yeah, sounds good.
So it's so starting about 2.6 million. Well, okay, let's go back to the Miko. So the Miko is the greatest, according to some. I've seen different plots that don't show this, but it's the greatest departure in 47 million years of global cooling. So the planet Earth has been cooling for roughly the last, like I said, 47 million years. And at the end of this Eocene and then the start of the Oligocene, there is a dramatic drop in temperature. And all of this, no surprise, is related to levels of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. So as they're going lower and lower and lower, the planet gets colder and colder and colder. And by 2.6 million years ago, the planet reached the point where it was so cold that continental glaciation would occur, depending upon where we are exactly in the orbit of going around the sun, the Milankovitch cycles. But that only started 2.6 million years ago. And since then, we go in and out of glacial periods. And surprisingly enough, when you're in an interglacial period, the Sahara, so during an ice age, the Sahara is a desert. And when you're at an interglacial period, the Sahara turns green for exactly the same reasons. So roughly every 20,000 years, the Sahara switches between desert and savanna. And they've recorded at least 230 green Sahara periods over the last 8 million years. So it kind of was there before, but it's really taken off since the start of the Ice Age. And what happens then is you get huge lakes. So there was Lake Megachad, which was like 4.5 times the surface area of Lake Superior.
Oh wow, yeah.
And all this water. So what happens basically is the northern hemisphere, based on orbital dynamics, leans towards the sun in the summer, at Earth's closest approach to the sun in its orbit. So right now we're leaning away from the sun at our closest approach, and so that makes for slightly warmer winters because we're close to the sun, but it's still winter because we're tilted away from the sun. What happens then in the summer is that it makes for slightly warmer summers than normal and slightly colder winters. But what it does is, with the warmer summers, the hot air over Europe rises. And as that hot air rises, it draws the monsoons across Africa. And those monsoons then water the Sahara and turn the Sahara green.
Ah.
And like I say, there were people living there. And this is what Schock is basically referring to, because although he's got some numbers, he's kind of screwed himself lately by saying it is all tied into the Younger Dryas. So basically, the Younger Dryas is a return to the cold, dry period, so there is no precipitation. So he's 100% wrong about that. But there is this increased precipitation. So as the Ice Age came to an end about 15,000 years ago, we enter what's called the Bowling Allarad, and the Sahara turns green. Then in the Younger Dryas, the Sahara turns back to desert. And then at the end of the Younger Dryas, it turns green again, and it stays green until roughly 5,500 years ago. Now, it's a huge area. I mean, the Sahara is larger than the continental United States, so to lump everything to specific dates is kind of difficult. But
Right.
basically, that's, in grand scheme of things, that's what happened.
So maybe when
And
it
so-
starts drying out or starts transforming into a savanna, it probably takes at least a few thousand years for that process to happen then.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those questions that some of those people are asking. I mean, it could be thousands of years, probably quicker than that, probably hundreds of years.
Hmm.
But maybe 1,000 years or so. But again, depending where you are.
Yeah.
So what happened then is, well, first off, that's the precipitation, or at least it used to be the precipitation that Schock was pointing to, saying that's what eroded the older Sphinx. And that's what fell, and the reason that the pyramids and the other structures, ancient structures in Egypt, don't demonstrate that same degree of weathering and erosion from precipitation is because they didn't exist yet. Only the Sphinx existed. But there's a huge problem here. And that is, as I already pointed out, the Sphinx is in the Nile floodplain. So there was a huge lake, Megachad, and there are potentially other, even larger lakes others have proposed. And so all of that water was channeled down through the Nile Valley. So right now there's the Yellow and the Blue Nile, where there used to be another huge branch of the Nile called the Yellow Nile. It's now called Wadi Hawar, and it's dry. But in all of the wadis through the Sahara Desert, because right now the Nile goes through about 1,000 miles without a single tributary. Well, that is not the case during the Green Sahara period. They're all active, and the amount of flow going down the river is substantially higher. So the Nile is about the same length as the Amazon, and it has about a third the size of the collection area of the Amazon, but it has 1/100th the flow, something like that, of the Amazon. It's a trickle in comparison to the amount of water in the Amazon. But during the Green Sahara period, that is not the case. During the Green Sahara period, the Nile would challenge the Amazon as the most powerful river on Earth. So much water would come down the Nile that it created a lid of fresh water on the eastern Mediterranean. So if you came there, you tested the water, you'd be like, well, this is a lake. And it's
Wow.
not a lake. So yeah, so that's how much water was coming down. So had the Sphinx existed at that time, it would have been inundated by this Nile force, Amazon forced Nile River, and it would be destroyed. It would not be there. You probably wouldn't even find any remnants of it. It would be gone. And at the very least, it would show that it was flooded by the Nile River. And if you look, like I already described, the beds of the Nile, the beds at Giza actually dip. And a river doesn't do that. It'd be horizontal. And so it would cut across the bedding plains. And you would see that. We do not see that. The Sphinx is not older. The very precipitation that Schock says eroded it is proof that it can't be older, not the other way around. So those people that were living in the Sahara, as the climate changed, they became climate refugees, and they had to find a new way of life. So it was along the way they first congregated along the rivers and lakes, and then as they dried, some of them congregated in the Nile Valley, which became habitable now because the water levels went down to a trickle of what they were before, exposing some of the best farmland the world has ever seen. That wouldn't have been there before.
Right.
So that's how they got there, and it explains why so many archaeologists and Egyptologists are like, where do these people come from? Because they're pretty advanced from the moment they see a record of them in the Nile Valley. And I think for our brains, it's easier to imagine a lost civilization that migrated there from someplace, Atlantis or wherever, than it is to imagine that the Sahara was once green.
Right. And another thing I guess I've become aware of relatively recently is that I think really part of the reason why sub-Saharan Africa has had such a historical divergence from a lot of the rest of the old world is precisely because of the Sahara being there. Because if you look at the development of domesticated animals prior to the Sahara becoming a full desert, Africa was keeping pace with the rest of the world in terms of developing cattle and other things, and then all of a sudden it's cut off except for some narrow paths, and then you get to the point where I think it's not until the Common Era when chickens arrive in Africa. I think it's actually the early Middle Ages, and they only arrive via Madagascar by way of Indonesia or something like that.
That's the kind of thing that as an archaeologist that I don't know as a geologist, but yeah, that's fascinating. So that kind of leads towards perhaps getting to Göbekli Tepe.
Yes. So, because one thing I noticed that you pointed out in your presentation on it is how there are a number of sites that are very similar to Göbekli Tepe called T-pillar sites. And I was just hoping you could elaborate upon that.
Sure. So I want to give a little bit of a background on that because it is kind of fascinating. Well, so I don't know if you saw, I wrote an article that appeared in Skeptic magazine on Göbekli Tepe.
I think I
So
did see that on your
Shermer,
website.
yeah, so Michael Shermer asked me to write that, and that's a long story. I'm like, why is he asking me to write this? And of course I said yes. And then I was like, I am no archaeologist. I can't write this. There were times I was very, very, very frustrated with it, and I had to give myself a crash course in archaeology, and then also Jens Notroff from the German Archaeological Institute was a huge help I'm preparing that article. He's probably somebody that you could get on the show too. He's very interested in taking on the conspiracy theorists.
All right.
Um,
Have to do that sometime.
so so I started writing that article, and I was like, well, what's going on here? Because what Graham Hancock is saying is that, and there's some basis in truth here, not a lot, but some, is that it's dated right now to 11,700 years ago, and that it's a massive site. I mean, there are many circular enclosures with T-pillars that have yet to be excavated, and those are some of the largest ones. And the idea that they had all of these next to each other on a hilltop in Turkey with these T-pillars, it's just like, where did this come from? So it broke the paradigm that archaeologists. It wasn't. David Anderson, one of the archaeologists I've been in contact with, he said it wasn't, when I was writing that paper, he said it wasn't the idea that the farming first hypothesis was being undermined prior to Gobekli Tepe. And it was a slow process, but Gobekli Tepe just killed the farming first hypothesis. and that is that you to settle down, the first thing you have to do is you have to create agriculture, and you domesticate plants and then animals, and then you settle down into communities. You create a food surplus, and people diversify into different tasks, and now you can start creating megalithic structures. You can't do that as a hunter-gatherer, not because so often it's implied they're just not smart enough. They're definitely smart enough. They're just moving all the time. They're following the herds. They're following where the crops are, or they're staying in one place for some period of time and then moving on once they've depleted the resources in that particular area and move on to a new place. So Gobekli Tepe, everything about Gobekli Tepe says it's pre-pottery Neolithic. It is hunter-gatherers. There is absolutely nothing at Gobekli Tepe that is out of place for hunter-gatherers except the enclosures and the T-pillars. So how did that happen?
Right.
Well, it turns out I found the answer, and I've not seen anybody else make it that clear. So going back to the beginning, so in the early mid 1960s, it was the University of Chicago, I believe, and Istanbul, and in Turkey. They went out and did reconnaissance to identify sites worth investigating later as important archaeological sites. And to help them, so it was a group of archaeologists, I'm not sure how many, sounds like it's quite a few. And to help them in identifying whether or not they're looking at domesticated crops or wild grain, they had a botanist along called Jack Harlan. And for Jack, it was not his first time having been in Turkey, but he had actually been there. I'll throw that in. He was there earlier, and he was collecting wild varieties of wheat and bringing them back to the States.
Oh, wow.
And people like, why? Why are you doing this?
Right.
They're not productive. And it turns out that one of the varieties that he collected was resistant to a particular disease that was going around. So they crossbred the seeds that he brought. And so there's people who are alive because he brought back these non-productive seeds that turned out to be resistant to a particular disease.
Oh, wow.
So there is a value in that. In fact, the seed bank in Salzbad, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, in Norway, that was inspired by Jack Harlan. The guy who put that together says, yeah, that was Jack Harlan who inspired me to do that.
Oh.
So Jack is in Turkey, and he's asked to identify whether or not these seeds are domesticated or if they're wild. And I don't know, somewhere along the way, one day while the archaeologists were out doing their thing, and he's back at the campsite. He decides to perform an experiment. And he went out with his hands and a sack, and for 1 hour, he stripped the wild grain off the plants and put that in a sack. And then and so he told the archaeologist what he did that night. And then he asked if he could construct a sickle. And the archaeologist actually gave him some stone blades, the actual stone blades that people had used in Turkey to harvest wheat and other grains. And so he created a sickle, and the next day for an hour, he went out and he collected grain and kept that together, and he brought it back, and he made the determination that a family of 4 working for 3 weeks could collect more wild grain than they could possibly eat in a year. Now we have our answer. They didn't have to have farming. They had a food surplus without the farming.
And I guess that also doesn't even account for the greater abundance at that time of wild game.
Exactly. I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're coming through and eating the wild grain. So now we have our answer for Gobekli Tepe. So you don't need to invent a lost civilization teaching them to do anything. They did not have to farm. There's a few other places around the world where that was the case. One being in the Channeled Scablands in Washington State. There was, because of the salmon runs, the tribes that were living along the Columbia River could collect more salmon than they could eat, and they dry it and save it. So there was another spot where people had that. And there's some place in Australia and a few other places around the world. So it was a very unique spot. So you didn't have to have farming because they had all the resources that they needed. So there's your answer. Gobekli Tepe is not a mystery. And going back to this, when they did their recon back in the early 60s, they actually identified Gobekli Tepe and other sites. But what they did was they went to a place called Navali Quarry. And it wasn't that they most wanted to excavate that. It's that a dam was going in and the site was going to be inundated by the water of the lake behind the dam. So they had no choice they wanted to go there. And it turns out Klaus Schmidt was at that site. He was a student at that site. And there are T-pillars at that site. And there's also at that site, Navali Quarry, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, 10,000 years ago, it's the first evidence of domestication. I think that's changed, but right now it's that at that site, at least for some time, it was the first incidence where they actually determined that it was domesticated plants that they were harvesting at Navali Quarry. So Hancock likes to say that the people at Gobekli Tepe are the people who invented agriculture. Yeah, a few thousand years later.
Yeah. Well, I guess I know with Hancock, he's pretty bad about compressing time, as if everything happens all at once. He doesn't really seem to have a sense of chronology at all.
Well, he really focuses in on the carbon dates and other dating methods when it supports him, and as soon as the dating proves that he's 100% wrong, then he calls into question dating at all.
Yeah, or
you can't have it both ways.
Or he'll look at a site that's super cool, and it will be date to at the earliest 800 BCE, and he'll say, "But what if the site actually was older? Because if you think about it, this would be a great shelter for the kind of catastrophe I'm talking about."
Exactly.
It's like, well, I'm sure airplanes would have been really useful in the Punic Wars, but that doesn't mean they were there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is never rely on what Hancock or Carlson and even Schock, when they say that this is what conditions were at the time, never rely on them. I caught myself doing that. I'm like, well, they must be right about that at least. No, they oversimplify, they lump things together, they twist things around. Go do your own research, and you're going to find out that no, a lot of what they say isn't even close.
Yes, I dealt with a little bit of Hancock before. I've done a few videos on him. But I know you're more. Yeah, I guess your I guess bugbear is more Randall Carlson, right?
No, I'm not. I don't really care about any of them. It's just so it was about what 3 years ago now, somewhere in that range. Randall Carlson was on excommunicate. Wait, what's the name of it? I forgot the name. Excommunication, or what's the name of his channel?
I'm not
You know what I
sure.
mean?
I saw a
Ben,
couple
what's
of
his
his
name?
videos yesterday, but I don't remember the channel name.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the channel, but it's Ben is the guy. Um, I can't think of the name off the top of my head. Anyways, so he was on there, and Randall Carlson said, "Yeah, I got my 20,000 papers. I may have never published a paper." And he's like this, talking like that. I'm willing to go toe to toe with anyone. And I was like, okay, he put the challenge out. So I wrote to Ben, um, Uncharted X.
Uncharted X.
And I wrote to Ben and I never heard a word. I wrote to Randall Carlson. I never heard a word. And I was like, saying, I'll debate you. I'll take you on the nonsense you're talking about here. I'll point out what's real and what's wrong about what you're saying. Let's have that on. Let's go toe to toe. Let's do it. And well, he won't. So then I was watching another one of the videos, and one of the guys, Brad Young, was had a background on his YouTube video, and I could see the San Juan Inn in Mexican Hat, Utah, and I'm like, why is the San Juan Inn in the back of Brad's video here, his background on his video? And then I looked and I saw, well, they're actually and they are going back to Utah at that time to tell the truth about Utah and how all of that, again, geologists have no idea what we're talking about. It's all catastrophism. It's all floods. It's all this nonsense. I can't find much of what Carlson's saying there, but it's just absurd, the little bit that I've been able to find.
Yeah, because he says
So
that basically when the ice sheet melted at the end of the ice age, that it was pretty catastrophic and sudden, and that this all occurred almost instantaneously, rather than over a long
exactly.
period of time, which is the mainstream view.
But that doesn't work in Utah. I mean, okay, if you we can go to the Scablands if you want, but in fact, yeah, we will. But if you look at the Scablands, it doesn't work. What he said. We'll get to that. I'm gonna write that down. So, anyways, so it turns out that they were going there, and I was like, well, I was heading out west anyways, and I've stayed at the San Juan Inn. In fact, I was there probably 5 or 6 nights this past year. I went whitewater. Well, I wouldn't call it whitewater rafting, but I rafted the San Juan River, which goes right past there. And then I went out there. And so it was a 6-day trip. With a group of friends, had a blast. And then I also went to the very spot where Randall Carlson said he was going to show up at Muley Point. I was at Muley Point for the eclipse back in October. But so I tend to go out that way a lot. So I was like, okay, I was within a few days, I was planning to be there, and I just looked at their schedule and I saw where they were. In Mexican Hat, if you've ever been there, is like 3 hotels and a gas station, and that's pretty much it. So no problem tracking him down, but he also said he was going to be at Muley Point. So they never showed up there. I don't know why. I saw a beautiful sunset, and then I went into town and I found him. And they were sitting out back by the pool at the hotel, and I asked him if anybody has ever taken him up on his debate, to go toe to toe. He put the challenge out, not me. He said no, and I said, well, I will. And then we kind of went through what we know, and I said, well, I'm familiar with the Sphinx and Gobekli Tepe. I said, I'm not really up to speed on the Scablands. And he said he's up to speed on the Sphinx and the Scablands, but not really Gobekli Tepe.
Hmm.
So we shook hands and agreed, and I gave him my card, and I thought I'd hear from him. No.
Oh
And he
man.
does remember me because I saw him on another video where he was saying that I was suggesting that all of the erosion on the Sphinx was carved by the wicking water. In a sense, that's true. I would say that's all the erosion. The other stuff isn't even really erosion. It's the way that it was carved. So it's maybe not totally misquoting me, but that's not what I meant. Anyways, so I never heard from him. But because we said that, I said I wasn't up to speed on the Scablands that fall, I contacted Bruce Bornstead, who's got a series of guidebooks on the Scablands. And I asked if he would give me a private tour, and I explained why, and he said, sure. But he said, why don't you go to the Geological Society of America meeting in Portland this year? And we're hosting a 4-day field trip
Oh, wow.
with the principal investigators to the Scablands. So why don't you go along? I said, I don't know. Why don't I? So I went on that. So I'm now up to speed on the Scablands, and I can prove that Randall Carlson is wrong about everything that he's saying, because basically what he's proposing is that, again, we're at the Younger Dryas, and this is where I think these guys have really gone wrong. In the past, they used to be very vague in terms of exactly when the Sphinx was eroded, when Gobekli Tepe occurred. I mean, I have video of Hancock saying Gobekli Tepe, according to Klaus Schmidt, goes back 14,000 years. Well, no, Hancock never says that anymore because he doesn't like that date. That date doesn't fit the story he's now saying, even though he knows better.
All right, because now he's what was his date, like 20 to 30,000 years ago, focused on North America.
Well, so no, they've narrowed it down to the Younger Dryas. So 12,900 years ago to about 11,600 years ago, so roughly that's when. So that started and ended somehow both with a comet impact. So the first comet impact comes in somewhere in North America, I'm guessing, and it supposedly instantly melts the ice sheet. And when this ice sheet melts, it sends these massive floods across Washington state. And that creates the Scablands. Now,
Right.
that's Carlson's story, and it's 100% wrong. What geologists are saying that there's multiple floods. So there was a glacial lobe, the Purcell lobe came out of Canada, and it backed up a huge glacial lake that was as large as half the volume of Lake Michigan, held behind a 20-mile wide ice dam. And then that ice dam either the water floated it, or somehow went through, and it burst through and it released this water across the land. And it scoured the land. It's an amazing place. I mean, so it even tore up the bedrock away and created what are called coulees. And so normally when you have a river creates a V-shaped valley, but these are flat-shaped valleys. And it's the characteristics of the underlying lava that created that, and the massive floods. And then what happened is the ice lobe advanced again, and the lake reformed, and 30 to 50 years later, the lake just breaks the dam again and floods the land. And there's evidence that there could be 100 such floods. There's evidence that they may go back 2.6 million years to the beginning of the Ice Age. And some people have suggested it could have happened 1,000 times.
Wow.
But to Randall Carlson, it happened once, and it happened at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Now here's the problem for him. The Ice Age ended. We were talking about that earlier, that the Sahara turned green about 15,000 years ago. So 15,000 years ago to the start of the Younger Dryas, say round off numbers, 13,000 years. For 2,000 years, the ice had been melting. And so by the time the Younger Dryas comes around, the ice has retreated about half the way up towards Hudson Bay. And so if you did melt it, it wouldn't send that water down the Columbia River. It wouldn't send it into Washington state. It would have gone elsewhere. And more importantly, it would have also, had it been there somehow, the Okanagan lobe, another lobe that dammed the Columbia River further downstream, was there 15,000 years ago, but it was no longer there 13,000 years ago. So if you release the water, it wouldn't go along the higher ground where the scablands are. It would have just followed the Columbia River downstream. So, and then, if that's not enough, when I went on the trip, we stopped at a site down from Dry Falls. So Dry Falls is often compared to Niagara Falls, but it's actually larger and it's like double the width.
Oh,
And you can't imagine like Niagara Falls where there's just a river going over a cliff. The water was probably 300 to 400 feet as it's going over the cliff of 400 feet, and it was 10 miles wide
whoa.
as we came through that area. And downstream of that massive flood, these almost unbelievable floods, there are lake varves, these soft lake sediments. And in those lake sediments, there's volcanic ash. And that volcanic ash, last I heard they were dating it, but they hadn't gotten it. But there's not that many eruptions. It appears to be a volcanic eruption that occurred 13,600 years ago. So that means that the last of the floods, and all the other geological evidence supports this, that the last of the floods happened prior to 14,000 years ago.
Right.
But Carlson has to have it happen roughly 13,000 years ago. It doesn't work. This one piece, and originally Brian Atwater was there, and he's one of the principal investigators who mapped the area, and he kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he goes, I mapped it as a silt. He didn't realize that it was a volcanic eruption. So that just blows the whole hypothesis that Randall Carlson has that the scablands are a single flood that occurred at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. That's impossible. I think you can see why he doesn't want to debate me.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be exposed, partly because he and Hancock have more or less melded their theories together now. So if one of them falls, then both of them fall.
Well, yeah, and I think so. There's times that Randall Carlson has been on Joe Rogan, and it's one of the links I have on my webpage. And Randall Carlson is describing the massive floods that would have destroyed the Sphinx. He's wrong about the source, but he's right about how massive those floods are. And he's fairly close, right, on the dates that he presents on Joe Rogan. Well, Hancock has got to be listening to this. If he's got half a brain, he's got to realize that everything that Randall Carlson is now saying proves that the Sphinx can't be older. But he doesn't say a word. So right. I think he's well aware. I think Graham Hancock is well aware that much of what he's saying is inconsistent with itself. Don't look at the facts too much. Just go with the loose kind of, perhaps this and maybe that kind of story, but don't look at the details.
Well, I do have to say I do regard Randall Carlson much more highly than Graham Hancock for one reason. I mean, Carlson might have some questionable interpretations, but at least there's some evidence he looks at. At this point, Hancock has kind of abandoned the premise that evidence matters. Like there have been times he's made claims where he conveniently will make a claim and then say the evidence was destroyed, therefore we can't find it. So, for instance, so all the Ice Age civilizations were located on the continental shelves. So obviously, they got washed away. No need to look for them. But he's right. So, there you go.
So that brings up an interesting point that I'm always like trying to figure out. They're saying that Atlantis, because all of this, Robert Schock talks about the A word, and he can't use the A word around geologists because we're just not ready. In reality, he can't use the A word around geologists because he can't defend his nonsense. Right. If he was a scientist, he'd be enjoying the fact that he's going to correct us. That's not a scientist. He's afraid to mention it around geologists. But if Atlantis existed and it was a seafaring nation, and we're finding that there's artifacts that have been transported. I mean, this is one of the cool things that I learned, what little I know of archaeology. This is more your area, that we're finding artifacts that have, ended up in England from the Middle East and places all over. Where, and we can identify the rock where it came from and such. Where are the artifacts from the seafaring nation called Atlantis. There should be things that you as archaeologists got to be scratching your head over saying, where in the world did that come from?
Right. I mean,
And I don't think it's there.
I mean, well, technically, I'm a historian rather than archaeologist, but even so, if I were looking for any kind of match to Atlantis, the best candidate would be the Minoans, because they're right on Crete. They were very advanced. They were wiped out by the Mycenaean Greeks, so there might be some chance of a vague memory of the Minoans that had lasted 1,000 years to be written down by Plato. So I mean, if you're
So is
looking,
that Thera? Santorini?
yeah, so there's Thera and Santorini, and then that island exploded, and that was a huge setback for the Minoans. But actually, they don't get finished off till a couple hundred years later when the Mycenaeans come from the mainland of
So I can
Greece.
tell you why they don't use that, because that happened about 3,500 years ago. So the Sphinx was already 1,000 years old.
Yeah, so I mean, for those two guys that we've been talking about, this would not be of interest because it's too recent. Um, and also, I mean, personally, I believe, having studied a lot of Plato, that the whole thing was made up as an allegory, and that there's no basis to it whatsoever. However, if you were going to find a physical basis, the best candidate would easily be the Minoans of Crete and Thera.
So I mentioned that to Flint Dibble when I did a live stream with him, and I don't know if it's part of the actual video or before and after discussion. He didn't like that one bit. He was like, "No, that's not the case." I was like, "Okay, it doesn't matter to me." I mean, I think it's interesting that there are some stories that are around, and these myths seem to have some element of truth. But all in all, you got to go by the actual evidence,
Right.
not the stories. The stories are an interesting aspect of it and maybe shed some light, but they're not the starting and ending point.
Exactly, and I mean, it's also worth mentioning that even if there was some genuine myth that Plato were recording, and he never really felt compelled to be super strict about adhering to stories as they were told, uh, but even if he were, it would still have been a story from a very long time before, and he also claims that he got it through a recollection that Solon had when he was visiting Egypt and talking to a priest about a story that they told from 9,000 years before. So yeah,
It
like
just
just
made me
the
think of
chain,
something.
the daisy chain of custody here is getting a little thin.
You made me think of something. I mean, so I've pondered, does Hancock actually believe what he's saying?
I
And,
don't think
and
so.
Rogan and Schock. Well, I think that Schock does. I think that Carlson does.
Rogan
I don't
does.
think Hancock does. I think Hancock is trying to be sort of an Arthur C. Clarke with like 2001, and he's sort of a H.G. Wells, and he's trying to put together a story
Yes.
that fits the evidence. And I think it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. What
Yeah.
matters to him is whether we're having a discussion, as we are doing right now, that he's smart enough to have told a story that causes us to discuss it, just
Yeah.
like Plato.
No, I
That was
actually
the idea.
yes. Ironically, yes. But I'm pretty much sure that at this point that Hancock is at least half grifter, and that's because he wrote a book in the '90s called The Mars Mystery, where he was claiming that there were pyramids on Mars, and of course, this has been refuted by further photographs. But his claim was that he would not be convinced he was wrong until and unless astronauts trained in geology landed on Mars and thoroughly investigated every site, which he knew was never going to happen, at least not within the next couple hundred years.
Yeah, it
So,
doesn't take that level. I mean, so there's no question that Mars, billions of years ago, would have been habitable in an Earth sort of sense. But that was so long ago, and I've talked to people, and I've seen people some of the principal researchers even, and I've seen videos, and they're saying they wouldn't even expect to find evidence of life, let alone a civilization, because it wasn't habitable for that long. So if you look that far back in Earth history, I mean, yeah, there may be single cell organisms, but even then, they have to look at it in detail, and then they have to convince themselves and others, and to try, as well as they can, to figure out, was that really something that was alive, or is it really something else? Because the rocks are so old. So the rocks on Mars wouldn't be as metamorphosed. They might be more intact and easier to discern.
Right.
But they said you wouldn't even probably find single cell organisms. It'd be difficult to find. Not
Right.
that life wasn't there.
Well, the other interesting thing about the Mars mystery, Hancock's theory was also, and again, of course, no evidence for this, that Mars was wiped out by a nuclear war, and that's why it became uninhabitable.
So those sorts of things are easily discernible. I mean, so there was a natural, I don't know if you're aware of this, and I read this like, I don't know, 40 years ago now in Scientific American. It's really kind of cool. There was a natural nuclear reactor on Earth.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and it was a combination of a few things. I mean, so yes, the amount of radioactive material through time is getting less and less. But if you go back, and I can't remember, I think it was like 2 billion years or so, it was higher. And uranium is water soluble. And so I think it's the oxide of uranium. I'm not sure. But whatever. So what happened is that there was a area that was highly radioactive, had a lot of uranium in it, like concentrated like in a mine sort of area, and then it was eroded, and then it was weathered, and then eroded, and it was carried downstream to a river delta. And where that delta entered the ocean, the chemistry changed. And the uranium that was contained in the water precipitated out and concentrated in the delta. Then later, the ocean levels fell, or the area was uplifted, one of the two, and rain fell on the ground on that delta, and again dissolved the uranium and concentrated it, because it again precipitated out with the chemistry change at the water table. And that two-step process was enough to create a nuclear reactor. And the way that they know that is you can come in there and measure those isotopes. And the isotope ratios are wrong. The only way you could get that level, those particular isotopes in the environment, is through a nuclear reactor. There's no
Wow.
other way of getting those. And that's how they came to that conclusion. And when I went to the GSA conference, not this year, but a year ago, I talked to somebody and he said, and I was like, this is insane. And then I read an article that said the same thing. They're actually now being able to decipher the geologic record so accurately in the past. Those perturbations that I was talking about, like the Milankovitch cycles,
Right.
they're finding those in the distant past. I don't remember how far. And because so they can see the different layers are recorded in the rock, and they said it's like picking up a song. So you can pick up part of the verse here, and then you got a gap, and you pick up a verse. And the guy I spoke with at the GSA conference, he said, that they can measure this and prove Einstein right. And that's when I went, what?
Wow.
And at that point, a friend of his came up and started talking, because people haven't seen each other for a while. I walked around and then came back, and we talked about it a little bit more. He was a little hesitant, but I was like, oh my goodness, that's the way we're measuring stuff. By the way, when I was there, I was talking to, have you seen the dating the footprints at White Sands?
I have not.
So that's like, I think they're dated to like 23,000 years now, and so it's the oldest evidence of humans in North America. And I was talking to that guy about something else at his poster presentation, and then all of a sudden his co-author, this woman, walks out, and I looked at her and I go, I just saw her in a video. And then I looked at him again. I said, I just saw you in a video. What did you do? Who are you? And he turns to her, he goes, I guess it's out. Well, he was on Nova. They were the people who dated the White Sands fossils.
Oh, nice.
I was like, and he remembered my presentation on the Sphinx. I go, yeah, that was me. He goes, oh, that was cool.
Oh,
So,
wow.
and when I mentioned, I know these conferences are great. So when I mentioned, the stuff that I'm doing with the Sphinx, how I got into that, he went off on this tangent on the black mats and why Hancock and Carlson are wrong about the mats. And I was like, something I haven't really looked into. At some point, I may start a channel. I asked him, would you appear on? He goes, sure. So
Yeah, that'd be neat.
So the other person that I met at that conference was absolutely insane. Because I'm looking, when you go to a conference, you're like, who's here? So, do you know who Walter Alvarez is?
I've heard the name, but I don't know who he is.
You ever hear of an asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs?
Yes.
Okay, well, he's the one who found the iridium layer. He and his father. He
Oh.
didn't. He didn't find the asteroid, but he found he found the iridium layer. So he was giving a presentation on. This comes back to the Sphinx. He was giving a presentation on Lake Megasud. And I was like, so I kept, because that's part of the Nile, or at the time he's saying it may not have been, but it is now part of the Nile River basin. So I was talking to him about the Sud Swamp, and he's explaining Lake Megasud, and I was, saying things about the area. And he looked at me, he kept saying, how do you know this? Nobody knows this. How do you know this? Nobody knows this. So after I got back, I sent him some papers that I had on this. So this is basically what. So it was a lake that was 7.4 times the surface area of Lake Superior. So it dwarfs Lake Megachad. And he's saying that it occurred. Now this is about 3.2 million years ago. But then he said, let's go over what's your presentation, because his poster presentation was exactly the same time as mine, and I stepped away. And he goes, it's approaching the time you have to be here. So he came over to mine, and I said, well, mine's about finding the Middle Eocene climatic optimum in the head of the Sphinx. I said, it's sort of like finding the iridium layer that killed off the dinosaurs, and I can't believe I'm telling you this.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So yeah. So he put together, he's got a really cool article on it, but so it gets into the whole Nile River basin and how that's changed over time. And he's actually proposed that there could have been a mega flood that went down the Nile. He's not sure on the date. Could have been like 3.2 million years ago. And flooded down right past where the Sphinx is. 3.2 million years ago, a huge mega flood. So, anyways, it all comes around.
Yeah, it sounds like
conferences
those conferences
like
are the ones to go to. That's so it's the what did you say the conference is called again?
Well, that was the Geological Society of America meeting, and I chose that so I presented there twice. I presented a paper in 2014 in Vancouver, and that was the before and after thing, that those three different pictures you had looking at wicking groundwater at the Sphinx. And I realized that process was not occurring until the Sphinx was carved and they created the Sphinx enclosure, that they carved down to that level. When they carved down to that level, they intersected the capillary rise zone, and that's when the water started wicking up from groundwater and concentrating the salt at the surface. But that only occurs if the enclosure is not buried in sand. And for most of the time, the Sphinx has been buried in sand. And so that the sand, you need something like a clay, and the weathered limestone beneath the Sphinx acts more like a clay. But when you get a sand, it's too porous, so the capillary rise zone doesn't go very high. Certainly doesn't reach all the way to the back of the Sphinx, basically where the sand was. And so that turned it off. And so the sand actually protected the Sphinx, and there's no way that wicking groundwater could have created the erosional pattern on the Sphinx.
Ah.
So what did?
Yeah, exactly.
How much longer do you want to go?
I'm good to go as long as you are.
All right, let's go a little further.
All right.
So what caused the Sphinx to look eroded? I went through and I did a detailed examination, detailed history of the Sphinx, and I kind of felt it was a waste of time, but it wasn't, because I found like the Miko and explained why the layer at the neck is so soft. And I learned other things about it. But when I was done, I was back at the point where I was saying there is no geological process that can account for the erosion on the Sphinx. There's just no way. There's nothing in its past. There's nothing, certainly nothing over the last 4,500 years. I'm at a loss to explain why the middle section, member 2 of the Sphinx, looks the way it does. So kind of out of frustration, I went back and I watched the original video that got me into all of this. And part of it was where Mark Lehner teamed up with a guy and they were going to carve a new nose using ancient techniques. So they used two-handed pounders, which is just a solid, kind of rock, maybe granite or something, something harder than the limestone. And they would take that and bang it onto the surface of the rock that they were trying to carve, and it would flake off. The other thing they used was a stone hammer, and it's a slightly smaller rock, and they carved notches on it, and they put sticks, and they tie those sticks together with leather and created what's called a stone hammer. And they use that to pound the rocks. And then they use copper chisels for detailed work. So when Mark Lehner, and I forgot the guy's name, in Maine, they were trying to carve a nose, they got this incredibly high quality limestone, almost a marble, the kind of thing that you would, if you had any sense to it, carve a statue out of. The Sphinx is nowhere near that high quality limestone. Perhaps they had, but certainly not the member 2. And that's when I realized, well, they also went further. They actually were having a guy in Egypt then carve a small Sphinx from some of the limestone, again, high quality limestone. And he was complaining that it was even bending his stainless steel tools, his modern tools. So I realized, okay, well, they screwed up because they're all using too hard a limestone. And that's not what it is at the Sphinx. And so then I realized, well, if you have these ancient tools, these primitive tools, not advanced tools like Carlson and Schock and Hancock are saying they use. They seem to think the older it is, the more advanced the tools.
Right.
No. These were very primitive tools, and they flaked it off, and that's what created the erosion, what people have misidentified as erosion on the Sphinx. I had my geologic blinders on. It wasn't until I included archaeology that I went, oh, duh, that's how they did it.
Yeah, I think too, sometimes there is a bad tendency to underestimate the amount of skill people had with what we would think of as primitive tools, because we have to remember a lot of the people who were masons at the time, this is what they did. This was their profession. They were trained to do this from childhood. So the level of skill they had with these basic tools was a lot greater than anything we can replicate when we, build our replicas and start playing with limestone. So I think that's
without question.
That's always
Without
something
question.
that they really short sell.
Yeah, there's people that was their lives. That's what they did. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anybody, because we have alternative means. So yeah, when they, like on the video with Schock, the original one with John Anthony West, and they ask a crane operator if he could lift the blocks, and and they talk about how big they are, and he's like, well, we couldn't lift them. Well, they forget to mention that nobody in their right mind would ever say anybody lifted any of those blocks. Because
Right.
I can tell you straight out, without having to get other people involved, you can't lift them without breaking them. They dragged them. We know they dragged them.
Yeah, because they're rope marks.
Well, yeah, I mean, so that there's a depiction, a hieroglyph that shows moving a big statue, and there's people pulling it, and then there's somebody actually standing on the statue and appearing to pour water lubricating it. And I'm thinking it wasn't just water. I would think that it would have used the sediment, the Nile sediment. I forget what they called it,
Like the
as
silt or
lubricant. What was it?
silt.
Yeah, it's silt, but it has a specific name that they used.
Uh,
Can't remember what. I think it starts with a K. Anyways, I don't remember. But they would have used that. They would use that to lubricate, and that's how they move these things. And also, when you're looking at like the largest block, I think it's the one that's in the Sphinx temple. Well, they don't mention that they actually dragged it downhill. They didn't drag that huge block uphill to the pyramids. They dragged it downhill from the Sphinx enclosure to the lower level of the Sphinx temple right in front of it. So they didn't move it very far, and they moved it downhill. So
right.
those sort of things they seem to somehow neglect to mention.
Yes, not to mention too that when we know how big the labor gangs were and how long they had to serve and all that, we know that clearly they were doing something that took time, and dragging those blocks would account for a lot of that time. You might only drag it about 20 feet in a day if you're lucky. I mean, you might spend a long time moving one of those blocks in place.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long it took, but yeah, I think that's part of it is we use our time frame to say, well, okay, it could be done, but that's going to take forever. Nobody would do that. Well, they did.
Yeah, I mean, and for them it had religious significance. I mean, this was their way of ensuring an afterlife for their rulers. So for them, this was the number one priority.
I mean, it's like the temples, I mean, the cathedrals in Europe, like Notre Dame. I mean, the people that donated that money, they were living in not much of a house, and they're doing what they can to build this, donate for the same reason, because it was their religion. It
Yeah,
had a purpose. It gave them a purpose for their lives, even.
yeah. I mean, for a lot of the Egyptians, this was one of the few opportunities they'd have to do something other than farm at home. So it was community building. Uh, it was a religious duty. They were, I think, mostly happy to be there, from what we can tell. They definitely weren't slaves, unlike what some people try to claim. And actually, some of them seem to have had genuine fun there. There are a few blocks in the pyramid where people have written graffiti, and to commemorate their time with the work gang
Yeah,
they're with. So there's one that said, this block was put here by the beer guzzling gang. So they're just
exactly.
celebrating their time together. So I mean, these weren't people who were upset about having to do this.
So, is there anything that you want to cover that I haven't?
Let's see. I see one slide here called Hall of Records. It's number 41 on the Sphinx. I was wondering if you could explain what this is supposed to be, because I've
Yeah.
never seen this before.
You don't know about the Hall of Records?
No.
Oh my goodness, that's part of what started all of this. Oh my God, there's a story there. So then you're not aware of this fact. Mark Lehner, do you know who that is?
I mean, I know you've mentioned him many times, and he's associated with the Sphinx, but I don't know that much about him.
He did his dissertation on the Sphinx. And but when he first went to Egypt, he was sent there by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Do you know who that is?
Yeah.
It's a good thing you don't. You're raising your IQ by not knowing what this stuff is,
Yeah, that
because
dude.
it's just nonsense. So Mark Lehner is from North Dakota, and his parents were into this kind of new agey alternative stuff like Edgar Cayce, and the scientists are keeping the truth from us. Lehner was one of them. He calls it his cognitive dissonance, and he went in the early 70s. Yeah, the early 70s, and they worked. I'm not sure. I don't know the details on this, but I think it actually had Walter Alvarez involved, the guy who found the asteroid,
Wow.
the iridium layer, and it was Stanford University. They all worked together. They did geophysics, they did geology, they did whatever they could to locate because the Hall of Records, because according to Edgar Cayce, he would get into this trance-like state. And in this trance-like state, he could tell you about your health. So you could send him a letter, and no matter where you're in the world, he go into a translate state and somehow pick you up and tell you what it is that's wrong with you and what you need to do for your health. And he also was talked about being in ancient Egypt, and he was actually Ra-Ta, and he was one of the supervisors who helped create the Sphinx
Oh
in a
wow.
previous life, even though he's a Christian and taught Sunday school.
So I'm guessing all this leads up to an explanation for why Graham Hancock in his debate with Zahi Hawass was demanding that they use a ground penetrating radar beneath the Sphinx.
Well, I can tell you that you can. It's been tried, and I can tell you you can't do that because you can't look below the water table, and the water table's down 5 meters. Yes, but that's why, because supposedly the Hall of Records is there. So Mark Lehner went to Egypt. Back in the day, they didn't have, the tight control that they have now. He met up with Zahi Hawass, and he called Mark Lehner the crazy American. And Mark Lehner, after all of his, and he ended up teaming up with a guy named Matthew McCully. I met Matthew also. So Matthew was a guy from Canada, and his grandfather wrote the Nancy Drew books,
Oh wow.
and he decided, well, he made money as a producer of a hit record. Sometimes when we touch, the honesty's too much. You know that song? Considered one of the 100 worst sappy songs, but it became a hit. And so Matthew McCully was convinced also that there's a Hall of Records hidden beneath the Sphinx. So he goes to Egypt, and he's this long-haired hippie meeting up with this clean-cut guy from North Dakota, Mark Lehner. They became good friends. Neither one of them was really into drugs or anything. And and they decided that they're going to figure this out. And so together, with all this research, there was a drill rig, and they drilled the very spot which would prove. And they were so happy. They were ecstatic because they were going to release to the world the knowledge, the hidden knowledge of Atlantis, because that's what's stored in the Hall of Record beneath the paw of the Sphinx, according to Edgar Casey. And they drilled it, and they found weathered limestone. They
Wow.
both told me, and I pressed both of them on this. They both said within a day, well, within a few hours to a day at the most. They almost used the same words. They moved on. They were like, okay, that was silly. There's no such thing.
Well, I mean, at least they had some sense, and there was hope for them yet. So.
Well, so Schock went out there and he did seismics to locate the Hall of Records. So he did tomography, and tomography is a very powerful tool. It's basically the same thing as a CAT scan. So you can't do very much with an X-ray. You can't focus it. But so what they do is when they do a CAT scan, is they take an object and they measure it multiple ways from different angles, and then the intensity of the X-ray will vary depending upon what the X-ray is going through. It'll change slightly. And then if you do that enough, and X-rays are very high frequency, they're very short wavelength, you can map in detail what's going on inside of a person's body. Well, you could do the same thing with seismics, but rather than measure the changes in intensity, you measure the changes in the arrival times, the seismic velocity. And so from that, you could determine whether or not there's a void in a particular area.
Right.
So in a sense, you could do that, but you'd have to do three-dimensional tomography. He did not. He did not do three-dimensional tomography. He did two-dimensional tomography at the level of the Sphinx enclosure. So at the level of the floor, they had a hammer that they'd hit on one side, and they had geophones on the other side. And then the different geophones that were evenly spaced on the other side would get different seismic velocities. And then they'd move over to a different station and hit the hammer again. And again, the geophones would pick up what's going on. And each one of those would be like a separate X-ray going through. And so from that, you can do a pretty good job of mapping the seismic velocities below the Sphinx.
Wow.
Well, like I said, it's at the level of the floor. So Schock somehow beyond my, I'm a geophysicist. I'm like, yeah, how? I don't think so. So he claims that he mapped a void using this technique. But then he kind of backs off a little bit and says that it wasn't really that technique, even though that's what he kind of infers in the article, that it was some Japanese people that did ground penetrating radar. And I know that that doesn't work because the water table's there, as far as I know with that. So yeah, so there's supposedly this Hall of Records, and Schock has proven that with his seismic data. I think what he actually proved, his hypothesis, in part, what he was trying to prove is that if the Sphinx is older, then the exposed floor of the Sphinx enclosure, which I already pointed out would have been eroded more than anything else because the water would have been channelized through it. And, you know, if you got 14 meters of erosion at the neck, well, it would have been a hell of a lot more than that at the floor. But he's saying, forget that. It wouldn't actually have eroded. It just would have weathered. And weathering means it would have had rain falling on it. It would have dissolved some of the constituents in the limestone, making it softer, which would lower its seismic velocity. So if his hypothesis that the Sphinx is older is true, then the floor of the Sphinx enclosure should have a lower seismic velocity than the limestone directly underneath the Sphinx, because it would have been protected from the Sphinx itself. Rain can't erode it, it can't weather it. So he went out and he did that, and he actually found exactly the opposite pattern. He doesn't point that out in his paper, but if you look at the data, you go, okay, you missed something here. So what he actually, the seismic velocities underneath the Sphinx are lower than the seismic velocities on the floor of the Sphinx enclosure up just next to the Sphinx outside. So he's disproven his hypothesis. He points out there's a high velocity to the north of the Sphinx, but he never mentions all the high velocities which are almost continuous to the south of the Sphinx. He does point out the low velocities below the Sphinx, but says those are attributed to the Hall of Records, which isn't there because it couldn't measure it because it's at the level of the Sphinx. So, I mean, I don't know. Is he a scientist? It sounds like he's convinced himself of some pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, that's I don't know. Some of the people who come up with some of these things, I mean, I can sort of understand where they're coming from initially, but after they try and fail to get their explanations across, and after they try and fail to experiment, I really do wonder how they cling on to it sometimes.
Well, I kind of was going to say that earlier about people. I don't know what made me think of it, but it's a point. And that is that they work with a gotcha. So they find this one thing. And by finding, say, the erosion on the Sphinx, or to find, I don't know, the dates at Gobekli Tepe, as well as it's been dated thus far. It's like, gotcha. And that's what they tried to do with Hawass. And it was despicable what they did to him. Because except for, so they have their gotcha moments. But so with the thing with Hawass is correct in saying there's absolutely no tie-in between Gobekli Tepe and the Sphinx. The people at the German Archaeological Institute will make that very clear. The Egyptologists, archaeologists will make that very clear. Just because Graham Hancock and Uncharted X and other people who don't know what they're talking about say that there is a connection doesn't mean it's there. And because of their gotcha moment, and Hawass didn't know about that because he didn't need to, because it has nothing to do with it. And they're saying that I'm important and I'm controlling the conversation. The scientists aren't controlling the conversation. They're the ones controlling the conversation, and anybody with any half sense of knowledge and archaeology would be following the nonsense as presented by Hancock and Schock and Carlson and others. And Hawass doesn't know any of it because it doesn't make any sense.
Right, because he does archaeology.
So when I went on that Channel Scablands tour, Vic Baker was there. So Vic Baker has written articles on mega floods. He's looked at Mars and the floods on Mars. He's at the University of Arizona. he actually met J. Harlan Bretz. So at one point when we were in the field, we're walking back to the vehicles, I asked him if he had any thought of what Bretz would, because it sounds like Hancock and Carlson to some extent are defending him. I asked him if he had any idea what Bretz would make of people like Hancock and Carlson, and I use those names, and he instantly responded saying he would be incensed. They're not speaking for them, and Richard Waite, who is one of the people who studied at the U.S. Geological Survey, who studied the scablands, he had no idea who Graham Hancock is. He has no idea who Randall Carlson is because they're not relevant. They're totally irrelevant in the scientific community, no matter how much those guys think that they're controlling a discussion and that anybody who doesn't include them in the discussion is just naive. No, they're naive in thinking they matter.
Right. Well, it's also interesting to me that, when Hancock got a show on Netflix, up to that point, his fame had always been slowly growing with his fan base. And then, now that he was put on a national spotlight or international spotlight, the vast majority of the people who saw this and were exposed to it for the first time came away thinking, oh, he's full of shit.
Yeah,
So
I saw that.
was his big opportunity, and it just failed miserably. And that was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Because also I noticed that he cleaned it up in terms of like talking about weird stuff. Like he took out a lot of the like his ayahuasca trips and how a goddess told him he was right and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, that's just so bizarre. So yeah, all of them though, Hancock and Carlson in particular, their egos are so big right now. They just think that they're the coolest, the best thing that's ever happened.
And the irony of the whole thing, though, is that's their big complaint when they talk about, quote unquote mainstream scholars. They'll say that mainstream scholars are too egotistical, and that they don't have the humility to consider these new ideas.
Well, they have to put together a coherent idea that fits the evidence, not their interpretation of select pieces of evidence.
Yeah,
and they don't come close to that.
I mean, I guess you've probably seen the comments of some of the stuff you've been in, and I've done, like I said, a few response videos to Hancock's ideas, and that's actually the number one complaint I get is that I sound arrogant by dismissing his ideas. So it's basically tone policing. It seems to be one of the major arguments that the Hancock fanboys like to make.
Yeah, thinking about that, and then we should maybe end pretty quick. Thinking about that, I this whole thing where I'm trying to get this debate. I mean, and then when Joe Rogan suggested that on back a year ago November, and Hancock, to his credit, said sure, but Carlson, knowing full well, and he remembers me. I know that because I've also had some other distant connections, so I'm not in contact with him, but it's through a grapevine. So he knows who I am. He now wants to debate me just on the scablands because I said I didn't know that. I'm willing to take him on that. He no longer wants to debate me on the Sphinx because he knows he's going to lose that debate. Right. He's also going to lose the debate on the scablands, but he thinks that I don't understand the scablands. I know the scablands probably better than he does now. And I said I'm also willing to take him on Utah because he's doing tours there. But getting back to this, so the people that are listening to Hancock and Carlson and such and Schock, I think what's missing in our society today, in our media, is really cool big picture science. And they are selling really cool big picture science. That doesn't happen on public television anymore. When I was a kid, there was like the Ascent of Man. For others, it was Cosmos.
Right.
And those programs aren't getting on. There's when Cosmos, when you had the reboot of Cosmos, it ended up on Fox. And I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson say why. The reason Cosmos ended up on Fox as opposed to PBS is PBS wanted to edit. And Fox said, no, we'll put on whatever you want. Whatever you put, we'll put on. But PBS wanted to modify it.
Oh,
And they're like, no, you air it or you don't air it. And so
wow.
they're and so the big picture science isn't there. Every now and then you'll find something. There was the human footprint was just on public television. I don't know if you saw it. Extremely well done. So there are exceptions, but it's they're showing Lawrence Welk, and reruns of Lawrence Welk are on public television. And so when I was younger, it was actually national educational television, and it was funded by the government, and they didn't have to get money, and they didn't care what the viewers were, because it was educational. Now it's like a regular TV station, where all they care about is what are our viewers.
Right.
That's what they do, and that's why nobody's getting, because you're not going to reach the huge crowd. You're not going to get the viewers. You're not going to get people donating money to watch some great science program. And the BBC has got tons and tons of amazing science program from people like Brian Cox, Alice Roberts, Ian Stewart. The list goes on. David Attenborough.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I think you make a really good point about why they have such appeal because of that lack of good public television for science. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right that we don't have really a current day Carl Sagan. I guess Neil deGrasse Tyson's about the closest thing to a massive. Well, I guess our Mikio Kaku is pretty big. But in terms of things geology related, I can't really think of any major publicly well-known figures that are on TV a lot.
No, well, there's never for geology itself that's kind of an oddball. But I mean, typically astronomy, you get stuff like Brian Cox.
Yeah, he's
I
pretty
mean,
well
and
known.
he's done some stuff, but here that's aired in the States. Um,
He also went on a speaking tour. I actually went to see him speak a couple years
Same
back.
here.
Yeah.
Was that the one with the big presentation
Yes, he was talking about the origins of the universe and how black holes work and things like that.
with that really high res video?
Yes, the one that shows the map of the
That was
universe. And
cool.
yeah, that was really awesome.
Yeah, I mean, so he does that. He does a great job. David Attenborough said of Brian Cox, "If I had a baton to pass, I would pass it to Brian Cox." So yeah, that's yeah, he does a fantastic job.
Yeah, because I guess the closest, the biggest American public intellectual actually still might be Bill Nye. I mean, obviously he's
It's
more of a
sad.
generalist, but he's probably the best known at this point that you can
Yeah,
get
and
on
he's
shows.
he's got a I've seen some of his stuff, and he's not a scientist. He's got like a bachelor's degree in engineering or something. I mean, he's good at what he does, and
Yeah.
he definitely is reaching the people. But I think to really do a good job, you need to have somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I mean, he's right there. He never he never stops. I got a funny story. I
Oh yeah.
once explained to Neil deGrasse Tyson why Pluto is a planet.
Oh really?
So he gave a presentation at the Distinguished Lecture Series at UW-Madison, and I went to that. And then afterwards, he had a book signing, and I waited until everyone left, and then came up and had him sign the book, and I said that a planet, like a star, should be defined by what goes on inside of it. And he said, well, how do you know what's going on inside of it? And I said, because it's round. So what happens is when a planet forms, that it becomes molten, in part from radioactivity and in part from the friction of the impacts. And when it becomes molten, the heavy stuff sinks to the bottom and the light stuff bobs to the surface, and it becomes round, and that makes it a planet.
Ah,
So
right.
under that scenario, Pluto's a planet.
Well, by
And
the
he said,
same
no.
logic, I mean, wouldn't most of the moons be planets too then?
Yes, and then so that's the point, is that so the archaeologists, I mean the astronomers are saying, well, then we'd have something like 50 or more planets in our solar system, and I'm like, yeah, You don't have any problems with billions and billions of stars and billions of galaxies. Why can't we have 50 planets?
Well, I mean, I guess you're right. I mean, it wouldn't really be that big of an inconvenience. You just have to stop teaching third graders to memorize the solar system.
Oh yeah, yeah, you wouldn't. My very eager mother just served us 9 pizzas wouldn't work anymore.
Yeah.
But so he said, read my book. So I did. And I read his book and I was like, it didn't convince me. But in fact, the thing that I learned, and again, I think he just did this personally to create a controversy. I don't think he really cares. And it did, and it worked, and it got science in the news. And so good for him. But the definition of a planet, there are, according to the definition of the planet, as that Neil deGrasse Tyson is advocating, there are 8 planets in the entire universe. There will never be more than 8 planets. Almost certainly there will never be more than 8 planets in the entire universe, because a planet is an object around the sun with a capital S. So
Huh.
anything around a star other than the sun is an exoplanet, and there is absolutely no definition of what an exoplanet is.
Because
We know what planets are, and there's 8.
I always
We don't
thought
know what
the
an exoplanet is. So when I watch Cosmos and I see Neil deGrasse Tyson using the word planet for something going around a star, I'm like, you're wrong.
well, see, it's interesting because I thought the new definition that excluded Pluto was it has to be something that the object has to dominate its entire orbit, so it can't
Right.
be. Yes, it has to have a dominant orbit. So I didn't know
Right.
that Neil
And that's
deGrasse
part
Tyson
of it.
put the sun part of it in.
So it's been said that if, and I've never verified this, but it's been said that if you took Mars and put it in the Kuiper Belt, Mars is not a planet, because it would not have cleared its orbit, because there's more material outside Mars at that point than there is inside of it. So that is not a planet.
Right, I've heard that too. I guess too. Ceres is the biggest object in the asteroid belt, but it's still not big enough to dominate.
So it used to be Ceres and Vesta. One of the two I know was at one point considered a planet, and then it fell out of favor. But yes, I'd include the moon as a planet. Anyways, I finally read his book, and then at the very end there was a table, and it listed Earth as a mass of 1, and then it had Pluto, and it was supposed to list it as 1 e to the minus 3, but they forgot the minus sign, so it made Pluto 1,000 times the mass of of the Earth.
Oh wow!
Which I wrote to Neil, and I said, well, that would make it a planet.
Yeah, that would make it probably a gas giant, right? I mean, that's be pretty substantial
Yeah,
at that point.
I don't know how dense. So he wrote back and he said it was a particularly embarrassing typo, and I was not the first person to catch it.
Oh, so Neil deGrasse Tyson actually responds to his emails. That's interesting.
Well, so I've written to him and saying, because I've tried. Here's the thing. So when I write to like Mark Lehner, the guy who studies the Sphinx, I hear back from him. I've contacted Farouk El-Baz, who's an Egyptian geologist. Long story, really cool guy. He wrote back to me. I contacted Scott Wing at the Smithsonian about hyperthermals. I contacted Walter Alvarez. I contact these people that are scientists. They get back to me. The people who don't get back to me, it's all the conspiracy theorists. I've sent it off to Joe Rogan many times before he ever raised this, about having a debate, about appearing on his show to explain this. Never hear from him. I've written to, Randall Carlson. Never heard from him. I've written to these, Uncharted X. That's his name. I never hear from him. So I write the people who are the scientists. I hear from them. David Anderson, and Ken, can't think of his name right now. But there's a ton of they write back. Scientists are there. These conspiracy theorists, for some reason, they don't want to talk to me.
That is odd. I mean, well, it's actually not odd.
Oh, it's
they don't
not
want to
odd.
get exposed,
That's their game plan.
But they don't want to. They don't want to debate anybody who can take them down.
No.
But then again, I feel like a lot of times because of the audience they're relying upon, even if they know they're wrong, if they just say that they're right, their fans will still be satisfied and still tell you later in emails that you got owned in the debate.
Look, I'm working on a paper right now to explain how the Sphinx was made, and then it was pounded back on these soft rocks, and I go through the whole detail of how it was carved and all this, and I'm gonna try to get that published. Now the thing is, if somebody comes along and says I'm wrong, I'd thank them. This is my best guess. I'm not saying you have to listen to what I'm saying. If you don't listen to me, you're wrong about everything. And I'm the only one who knows anything about the Sphinx. So don't listen to the other people because they're not going to tell you the truth. I'm saying, look, I did my best job. This is it. It might be wrong, but that's what I'm seeing.
Right.
I don't see any of that. That's a scientist. A conspiracy theorist like Hancock and Carlson and Schock, they're all like, my way or the highway. I understand it. If you don't understand, you're just wrong. You just can't see it.
And also,
You've got the blinders on. You don't understand.
it also
That's
assumes
not a
there's a
scientist. That's a conspiracy theorist.
it also assumes there's a big cover up on the part of academics because obviously, if you're trying to advance your academic career, covering up a huge discovery you could put your name on is a great career move.
Yeah, we're all trying to prove everyone else wrong. If I could prove that there was a lost civilization that built the Sphinx, I would be so famous. If I prove that a lost civilization didn't build the Sphinx, nobody gives a care.
True. Yes, that's what I was trying to explain in one of my Hancock videos where it talks about academics having some sort of conspiracy to disguise the truth. There's literally no reason any academic would ever do that. I mean, any academic, if they had the chance to, like you said, prove that the Sphinx was different than what it appears to be, they would do that, and then they would reap the rewards for decades.
Yeah, I mean, people are always trying to prove Einstein wrong. Scientists are always trying to prove all the other scientists wrong. That's what we do. I mean, like even the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs. That story's not over. There's people who are saying, well, maybe it's not so simple. And they're looking for other things that are happening at that time. And the idea then that the asteroid, to take all of the big 5 extinction events and lump them together and say they all were caused by asteroid impacts, well, no, the geologic evidence is against that.
Right.
So the idea, so this is a common misconception. And Carlson and Hancock and Schock, they all are not rectifying that instead of making it very clear that no. So like so this big global cooling event 34 million years ago, right around that same time, there were a series of asteroid impacts. There was one that hit off of New Jersey that was 20 kilometers across called Tom's Canyon. There's another one that produced a crater 85 kilometers across. It's the 4th largest impact crater over the last 500 million years, and it hit Chesapeake Bay. And then there's another one which hit Russia, creating the Papagai crater. It's 100 kilometers across. It is the 2nd largest impact crater since over the last 500 million years. Only the impact that killed off the dinosaurs is larger at 150 kilometers. And yet, there's a series of 3 impacts, all dated to roughly the same time, and they're separated enough from this extinction event that it appears like they didn't do anything.
Huh.
There's no extinction event. There's nothing in the geologic record other than dating them that says that anything of any consequence happened 37 million years ago. They're roughly about 37, and the extinction's around 34 million. Those numbers may change a little. So the
That is
idea that an asteroid impact, and that is the core of their argument for the Younger Dryas and the floods in the Channel Scablands, is that a comet came in. Well, they're so embedded on this idea, but it's not supported by the evidence.
Right. That's interesting. I didn't realize that there had been any major impacts that weren't linked to some kind of extinction event. So that's news to me.
So
Wow.
there was originally Jack Sepkowski. So I asked people this, nobody knows. Everyone talks about the big 5 extinction events. And I asked people, well, who named that? Nobody knows. Who looked at the geologic record and said, There's 5 extinction events. It was Jack Sipkowski and David Raup at the University of Chicago. It's their data. And what
Oh,
it was primarily Jack, as I understand it, he put all of the extinctions into a computer database, and he then looked at to see when they went extinct, in the geologic record. And so because of that, one of the first things he did is he said, yeah, we have these 5 major extinction events over basically the last half billion years. But then he went further, and he did a Fourier transform. He did analysis on it, and he found that there's a cycle. I'm trying to remember. I think it's 27 million year cycle of extinctions on Earth. So the asteroid impact, and so everyone is like, well, what in the world has got a cycle like that? So I remember reading the article. That was like 1983, and I figured out all of the possibilities, and they all fail because they're in and out of the spiral galaxies. Although, what's her name? Randall, can't think of her name, MIT or Harvard. She wrote a book about the dinosaurs. And that's,
um,
anyways, Lisa. Anyways, so if I remember right. So, anyways, it turns out that they invented that perhaps the sun is actually a binary system. After all, most stars are binary systems, and so we have a second star called Nemesis,
right.
and this second star now they've somehow it's converted lately into a planet, but it was actually proposed as a star, and so this star would and right now it's at the because it's like halfway through. It's like 14 million years from now, so it's out there, and it's such a dim dwarf star that we can't pick it up and don't know it even exists and don't even know it's actually in orbit around our sun. But when it comes barreling through the system, it messes with the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud and has that material fall into the inner solar system, increasing the chance of an asteroid impact on Earth, causing these roughly periodic impacts.
Right.
But that doesn't seem to be hold true. And so the thing is again, guess what? I met Jack Sipkowski when I was president of the Geology Club, and this article was published. I mean, it was a major article. I wrote to him and I said, would you be willing to come to the geology department to give a presentation on that in Milwaukee? And he did. Here we again have the difference. And I screwed up because I was taking a class in digital signal processing, not in the geology department, and I didn't look. And I had an exam in my class on that evening. So I didn't see his presentation.
Oh no.
And I explained to him I wouldn't be there, and that he then offered to meet me after my exam. And so I sat down and had beer with him and talked one-on-one.
Oh wow.
That's the difference between a scientist and a conspiracy theorist, who I never hear from.
Yeah, and also
Yeah,
just the ability to make adjustments as you find out that things don't work.
yeah. I
Which,
mean, unfortunately, he passed away. I think he was 50 years old. He had a stroke or something, and he was like 50 years old and passed away.
oh man, it's unfortunate.
Yeah. But yeah, so I met Jack Sipkowski. I'm like, so that's, but, you know, so, these people are accessible. And these conspiracy theorists and Joe Rogan, they're not accessible. They don't want to hear from me.
Yeah, I feel like with Joe Rogan, his criteria for what goes on the show is just what's the weirdest take on something.
Yeah, but I think he also likes controversy, and so if I take on his, the controversy, he's embedded in this now. By the way, he had Elon Musk on, and my nephew texted me to say that, so I watched it, and Joe Rogan was like telling Elon Musk that there's an advanced civilization 30,000 years ago, and Elon Musk's response was, "What difference does it make?" He said, the universe is 14 billion years old. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. If you want to move a civilization back from 10,000 years to 30,000 years, it doesn't make any difference. You could just see how disappointed Joe Rogan looked.
Yeah, and actually, That's not a bad point. That
No,
because I usually don't agree with a lot of what Elon Musk says, but that's actually a reasonable point.
it doesn't change anything.
Also, I mean, because we have nothing that's remained from that if it did exist, so it didn't have a big impact on our development.
Well, supposedly it did because of the reboot of being taught how to build,
Pyramids.
megalithic structures at Gobekli Tepe.
Well, the thing that always bothered me too with the Hancock theory of this knowledge being passed down, he also claims that in Mesoamerica the pyramid building there was influenced by the same source civilization. So why did they
So you're
wait thousands more years?
so you're an archaeologist. I mean, even today, we have technology, and if somebody's going to move technology around, so you can hear somebody speak in a language you don't understand, and all of a sudden they'll say internet, or they'll say computer.
Right, right.
So if this technology came from them and they taught them, they'd be using the words. And since they were a worldwide civilization around the world, we would have the same words for the same technology. And we don't.
Or at least related words, or some. Yeah, there would be at least a few terms that are shared, and
Yeah,
they're not there.
it's not there.
Well, and the thing I point out sometimes, because I know a lot of people who are really big pyramid fans, they think of them as being really sacred. But at a certain point, if you think about the material of it, if you're talking about stacking large rocks together to make effectively an artificial hill, it makes sense to have a bigger base than top. So the pyramid design is kind of dictated by the material at a certain point. So
Well, there's also the evolution. You can see from the mastabas and then the stacked mastaba and then the true pyramids.
right.
There's an evolutionary step. All the steps are there.
And not to mention that the ziggurats were in Sumer a few hundred years before the Egyptians built pyramids, so they sort of had a model in a way when they were trying to start building monuments. Uh,
So I went out into the Sahara to see a place called Wadi El Atan, which is the Valley of the Whales where these whale fossils are lying on the ground. It was really cool. But as you look around, there are structures, natural structures eroded in the limestone that look like pyramids.
oh,
You want to know where that idea came from? I mean, I
yeah.
remember taking somewhere. I've got a picture of one. I'm like, if I didn't know better, I'd call that a pyramid, and I know it's not.
Well, the same thing is true for mummification. I mean, one of the most common theories is that there's, I forget the name of this type of salt, but if you die near it, it will preserve your body with almost the full mummification process. So bodies would be remarkably well preserved by this salt. So the Egyptians figured out how to collect it, and then they also figured out which parts of the body are most likely to rot, so they removed them. And then that's where they got their idea for mummification. And the
So
process.
there's actually the Black Mummy of Africa or the Sahara, something like that. That's what I remember the video being called. But it's about a young boy that was found buried in the Sahara when the Sahara was green, when the hunter-gatherers were there, and it's mummified. This boy's body was mummified. So guess what? These are the people who migrated
Yep.
into Egypt. So they were mummifying at least some bodies before they ever got to the Nile Valley. There's evidence of that.
Yeah, and I mean,
Why they did that, I don't know.
well, I guess it was just something that they thought was pretty cool at first, and they also thought it was desirable to preserve the body. Eventually, it became about religion, but in terms of, I imagine maybe this practice might have even pre-existed a lot of their religion. But yeah, I mean, they just figured out things would occur in nature. They would, for whatever reason, like those things, and then they'd try to figure out how to do it on purpose and control it, just like with
I don't
agriculture.
know. I don't know how prevalent that is, but it definitely is, and I forgot what the date is on that. But we should actually get going pretty quick. Is there anything
Okay.
you want to cover?
Um, I think that pretty much hits everything I wanted to talk about today. But yeah, definitely, everybody be sure to check out Robert's work. So, Robert Schneiker, you have a website. It's just
Yes.
robertschneiker.com.
Yep.
Okay.
Schneiker.
Schneiker, sorry. Um, and you also have few talks out there you can find on YouTube. You have some publications, and of course, you were trying to debate Randall Carlson. So, anybody, if you
Well,
see videos of Randall Carlson, leave a comment that he needs to debate Robert Schneiker.
yeah. I'm also doing other things. Right now I'm working, like I said, on a Sphinx paper. I've actually got a paper on there's why the Sphinx is the erosion from weakened groundwater is increased on the Sphinx and the source of that water. And I've actually got another paper, so I've got at least 2 or 3 more papers that are coming out on the Sphinx at some point.
That sounds pretty cool. Yeah, so we'll definitely have to follow that. Well, thank you again for joining
Thank
me
you.
today, and yeah, definitely you're welcome back anytime to talk more about archaeology, geology, and conspiracy theorists.
Well, I learn from people like you about archaeology because I'm very much a geologist. So yeah, it's a learning experience for me. And I gotta say that there's a real positive to doing all this. And I've seen Hancock and Carlson actually say that on Rogan. I mean, the places that I've been, the people that I met, the things that I've done, I wouldn't have done much of this if it weren't for me getting involved in this. So it's been a real positive. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember one time my uncle, who's in the sciences, told me that worst case, if somebody comes up with a dumb idea, then at least in refuting it, you figure out one thing that's not true. That's worst case scenario.
Yeah, I found a lot of really cool things. Like I said, I was in the Sahara, you know, I met Walter Alvarez and things like that. I never would have done that. I'm not one of those people who likes to get out and do that. That's totally out of character.
Right. Yeah, that
All
sounds like a
right.
cool trip. All right, well, thank you again, and I think what we'll do is set this probably debut tomorrow, so that way people have a chance to get pumped up for this.
All right. It's going to be long.
It will
Oh,
be 2 hours and 16 minutes, so I think we're gonna end
I
it.
guess that's like a Joe Rogan episode, a shorter one.
Yeah, exactly. Just without the DMT. All right.
Oh yeah,
Well, I'm gonna end
let's
it right
talk about
here.
that.
Yeah.